which was not the answer I was expecting. But I've sort of spent the last 30, 40 years sort of unpacking that koan. She's no longer on this plane of dimension. She's gone to another plane. So in the next life, I can talk to her more about it. But that's sort of where I've come from. This engagement, this interaction, this dialogue between Buddhism and Christianity. And of course, now, as many of you have noted, we've had this explosion of mindfulness. It's quite interesting to tease out some of the similarities and connections. So that's really where this paper's coming from. And as a number of you have said, it's becoming a pressing pastoral need, which is why I've called it Mindfulness Christianity and Pastoral Care, because it is something that's coming up quite a lot now in the pastoral situation, in therapeutic. I'm a psychotherapist and a spiritual director, so it's coming up all over the place. And I thought it was important, not least for my own intellectual constructions, to have a sort of handle on what this thing is and where it's coming from and so on. So out of my own explorations, this is where this paper arises, and it's an ongoing process. I'm still, every year I go, I've helped set up a centre in Bangalore, and one of the universities there, for psycho-spiritual formation. So every year I spend a few weeks in India, southern India, talking to groups not unlike this one here, from all over India. And so lots of interesting things coming up there and how they relate to what's going on here. So I want to bring it in. It's a bit of a melting pot, a bit of a stew. I'm going to throw all this in. Let's see what happens. It is a printed paper, so I'll read out some of it, but I'll try and talk to the paper rather than just reading it out. Many commentators, not least Christian commentators, have been taken aback by the seemingly unstoppable rise of the Mindfulness Revolution that has swept the country over the past decade. Why this should occur now, and how much it relates to the current fashionable trope of "I'm spiritual but not religious," I shall leave to the religious sociologists to decide. My aim in this short paper is to reflect on the nature of mindfulness, especially as perceived from its Buddhist roots, as currently operative in the present British, Irish and American scene, and how this may or may not relate to the wider tradition of Christian prayer. I shall argue that far from a foreign import, mindfulness is not only endemic, but essential to the Christian understanding of how the human person relates to the divine. Essentially, my point will be that Christians have nothing to fear from mindfulness. Basically, we have been practicing it for 2,000 years before Dr. Kabat-Zinn and his co-workers came onto the scene. However, there's always a however, from an academic perspective, I'd like to add some caveats to the basic position I've just suggested, that mindfulness is good for you. One thing that does disturb some Christian souls, and you can do an internet search if you want to know more about this, is how far is mindfulness a covert input from Buddhism, and how far are Christians adopting Buddhist techniques, ideas and ideologies? This is not unimportant. Similar issues have troubled Christians over the past few decades as successive waves of Eastern wisdom have dashed against the Western fortresses of Christianity. Some of the older members of the room, the younger members won't remember, in the 70s there was transcendental meditation, TM, that was all the phrase. And then in the 80s and 90s we had yoga came in. And in the 90s we had Kabbalah with Madonna and so forth. And now we welcome mindfulness as the latest arrival. Perhaps some people argue their cumulative effect is to weaken the foundations of Christianity. Yet, as I've already mentioned, during my travels in India, I have encountered thousands of Christians who employ meditation and yoga as part of their daily Christian practice and have done so for years, if not centuries. whilst not showing themselves thereby to be somehow weakened in their Christian endeavour and mission. Quite the contrary, I must say. Yet, as other recent scholars, such as Gavin D'Costa in Bristol and Martin Ganeri in Oxford, have shown, there are conceptual and ideological difficulties in squaring Buddhist ideology and approaches to fit the Christian circle. And I think it would be intellectually naive to ignore them, something I do not intend to do in this paper. So the paper then will be in basically three parts. The first one, I'll look at the origins and purpose of Buddhist mindfulness. Then I'll go and look at the contemporary uses of mindfulness, and then I will end by taking a couple of examples from the Christian tradition of what I understand as Christian mindfulness. And in it all, I suppose, I'm looking for what Wittgenstein would call the family resemblances between the mindfulness tradition, the Christian tradition of contemplative prayer, as well as the health warnings or things that we need to just keep an eye on in terms of differences. As the discourse of mindfulness has developed in contemporary healthcare, psychological and educational settings, there's been a tendency to draw on non-Christian, especially Buddhist sources. A few years ago I ran a conference at St Mary's on mindfulness in the Christian, Hindu and Buddhist perspective, and it was amazing. A lot of people came. They didn't realise that these traditions were in the Christian background in particular. In this respect, when reference is made to mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition, writers are usually referring to sati, an Indic term from the Pali for which there is no straightforward or simple definition in English. The term was first translated into English, and I've put it on the board here, as mindfulness by Thomas William Rhys Davies in 1881. And there's the original phrase here. He said, sati is literally memory, but is used with reference to the constantly repeated phrase mindful and thoughtful, and means that activity of mind and constant presence of mind which is one of the duties most frequently inculcated on the good Buddhist. The equivalent term in the Sanskrit canon, and we have in Buddhism two basic canons, the Sanskrit one and the Pali one, the equivalent one in the Sanskrit canon is smriti, which literally means that which is remembered. And it is paired with two other qualities. First, watchfulness or alertness, which is seen as complementing the condition of mindfulness. And secondly, ardency, being intent on what you're doing, trying your best to do it skillfully. So mindfulness, watchfulness, alertness, and ardency. From all these three together, we aspire to what's called appropriate attention, yoniso manasikara. The term appropriate is apposite. As the Buddha suggests, it precludes useless metaphysical wandering of the mind into questions such as, is there a self? That's mind. Anyway, ignore that. Do you want me to switch it off? Or yeah, leave it. We'll be mindful. And just Professor Chris Mace, who is one of the contemporary writers who I'm very impressed by in this respect, in a perceptive essay on the origins and etymology of the term in its Buddhist context, emphasizes the range of meanings to which sati is susceptible. He, along with a lot of contemporary commentators, especially coming from the more non-theistic perspective, prefers the term bare attention. Now keep that in mind, because that is quite important. Bare attention as the nuance closer to the contemporary uses of the concept by mindfulness practitioners today. And he makes a distinction here from the Tibetan smriti, which contains connotations of the use of memory and understanding to develop right concentration. In fact, in its original context, it could be argued that heartfulness would be a better translation of the Pali sati. And I'll come back to this as well later on in the paper. When I was last in India, I had the privilege of having a dialogue with a Buddhist abbot, and I put this to him. I said, this term sati, is mindfulness the best translation? And he said, well, actually, and I said, would heartfulness be better? He said, actually, probably heartfulness is better translation than mindfulness. So we have to bear that in mind, that mindfulness itself as a term is probably better translated, if we go to the original Buddhist sources, as heartfulness. And this would accord well with the argument I'm presenting here. And in many ways, heartfulness is a better word for what we find in the Christian tradition, rather than a little bit more cognitive mindfulness. And as we go through the paper, I'll explore those nuances. That being so, with mindfulness being the current buzzword, like that other slippery term, spirituality, I'll continue to use the word mindfulness for the purposes of this paper, but bear in mind those caveats that I'm bringing up. Such mindfulness practices as advocated by the Buddha himself are clearly there for a specific purpose, and that is the recognition of the suffering of existence, what's called in the Pali Canon dukkha, and our release from that suffering is by the cessation of desire. Thus, the practice of mindfulness will help the patient from the sickbed, or in another famous allusion of the Buddha, act as a raft to assist our delivery from the flood waters of existence. As he famously put it in one of the sutras, our state in this existence is that of a wounded patient with a poisoned arrow in them. Would such a person, he says, when presented with the surgeon for the removal of the arrow, hesitate to say, I will not let the surgeon pull at this arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me, until I know whether the man who wounded me was tall or short or middle height, until I know whether this bowstring was wounded me was fibre or reed or sinew or hemp or bark. All this would still not be known to the man, and meanwhile he would die. That's very Buddhist sort of saying. So what the Buddha is saying there is, let's not engage in useless metaphysical speculation. So the whole point of the Pali Canon, the Buddhist teaching, is not about is there a soul, is there a life after death, a lot of the things that have preoccupied Christian discourse over 2,000 years, but it's how can the suffering patient be cured? How can we be cured of the pain of existence? So there's a very clear pastoral role for the Buddha. As well as specific exercises arranged around practices, so to achieve that, as well as specific practices such as breathing, and again, those of you who use it in your own practices will be aware of some of this because it's filtered into the present mindfulness scene. We have a whole encompassing of what we could call attentiveness on various aspects of life, including day-to-day practice. However, a great deal of Buddhist practice and teaching throughout its long history has been a wholesale critique of, quote, attempts to attain permanence, independence, and self-subsistence by identifying with the transient conditioned phenomenon, whether mental, psychological, or conceptual. That's a quote from William Waldron's book, The Buddhist Unconscious, a very good book. The sense of self as a permanent, unchanging I, existing against a backdrop of an objective other, is constantly critiqued in all Buddhist traditions. I call it from my Christian perspective, I call it the Buddhist agnosticism with regards to the nature of self. I've got into a bit of trouble with Buddhists about that. But anyway, that's how I see it. It's a sort of agnosticism. It's not saying there's no self. There is the term no self. And if you say that to Buddhists, they'll often get upset, It's not no self, it's an agnosticism. It's a sort of loosening of the concept of self. And of course, that's difficult for us Westerners. I mean, one of the joys of going to India is that people, whether they're Hindu, Muslim, even Christians, have a much looser sense of self. We have quite a tight sense of I, sense of self. People often blame Descartes. I think it's a bit rude to just blame one Frenchman for everything, but we certainly have it quite deep rooted into our Western way of thinking. So mindfulness is a way of loosening these tight views of self. As the Buddha said in another of the suttas, Subhuti, in what way does a bodhisattva, being aware that he has a body, practice perfect conduct? Subhuti, a bodhisattva when walking is fully mindful that he is walking. And you'll have heard similar things to this, When he stands up, he is fully mindful of standing up. When sitting, he is fully mindful of sitting. When sleeping, he is fully mindful of sleeping. And if his body is well or ill, he is fully mindful of either condition. So it's not just these little practices that we do, with our clients. It's a whole way of life. It encompasses everything. I must admit, personally speaking, for me, it's so beautifully shown in Buddhist art. This is from an exhibition in London a few years ago, on the bronze exhibition. I don't know if you saw it. This beautiful statue was just discovered about 5-6 years ago, one of these building sites in China. They're digging up the whole of China at the moment, and they found these beautiful bronze Buddhas. And something like that, I think, is a better description of Buddhist mindfulness than all this stuff. Just that sense of presence that you get in that Buddhist art, that wonderful stillness there. So mindfulness in this Buddhist tradition will accordingly assist us in moving from the grasping illusion of an essential self to the flexibility of a decentered, or what I call an agnostic self. In the Buddha's terms, we remove our attachment to the layers of existence to realize that over-identification with them is the source of delusion. Thus, in its Buddhist origins, mindfulness has a very specific purpose, which will be achieved by practical application of process. In the Mahasatipatthana, for example, these are classed as contemplation of body, feelings, mind objects, including exercises in breathing, posture and comprehension. And even as regards how the monk looks, wears, clothes, eats, drinks, chews food, goes to the toilet and falls asleep. So bear all that in mind when you're practicing your mindfulness. So that's the Buddhist background. And I think the point I'm trying to make there is that sati, mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition, has a specific ideological purpose. Its purpose is to help us, steer us through the delusion, the suffering of life, to achieve liberation, to achieve nirvana by the cessation of desire. And mindfulness will be the raft that will see us over the river. We already mentioned Kabat-Zinn, and John Kabat-Zinn, there is the gentleman, looking very mindful there. And so now I'd like to move on to the contemporary rediscovery, if you like, of mindfulness, which, as we've all said, has happened quite quickly. It's happened just in the last 10, 15 years or so. When the molecular biologist John Kabat-Zinn first developed his mindfulness courses at the University of Massachusetts in the late 1970s, he was not concerned with the metaphysical implications of Buddhist meditation practice. So that's the first point to note. He wasn't interested in the metaphysics that I've just expounded. Rather, he was more concerned in their clinical and medical efficacy. This novel notion, and you've got to hand it to the man, this is a very innovative way of looking at it. This novel notion of giving mindfulness meditation a sound clinical and experimental basis is what proved the essential catalyst for the subsequent explosion of mindfulness. 30 years later, the clinical evidence for the efficacy of these methods in treating illnesses as diverse as depression, cancer, and eating disorders is overwhelming, and we can't deny that. Even though latterly, at the end of last year, a couple of books came out, the dark side of mindfulness. There's inevitably, when you've got a strong case for something, there will be a counter movement against it, with the dangers of mindfulness. Thus, alongside courses such as Kabat-Zinn's own mindfulness-based stress reduction program, MBSR, the 8-week forerunner for many of the later mindfulness courses that you will find practiced now all over the place, where there are courses such as the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, which is, again, many of us here in this country will be familiar with, which is coming out of Oxford and the work of Professor Mark Williams and his Oxford Centre for Mindfulness. And he's sort of been a Kabat-Zinn's vicar on earth in England, and certainly has brought a lot of this stuff into popular use here. Kabat-Zinn himself defines mindfulness as, quote, paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. I'll give that definition again. This is from 1994. Paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Now that's, if you remember from what I said at the beginning of this talk, that's coming close to our bare attention. That sounds like the bare necessities, doesn't it? The Jungle Book. Anyway, the bare attention that we had earlier from Professor Mace. This bare definition is supplemented by many practitioners with wider values, drawing upon something closer to the Buddhist notions I've just described. Thus, Chosen Bays in 2011 suggests that it is, quote, deliberately paying attention, being fully aware of what is happening both inside yourself, in your body, heart, mind, and outside yourself in the environment. It is awareness without judgment or criticism. She goes further to state that, quote, when we are mindful, we are not comparing or judging. We are simply witnessing the many sensations, thoughts, and emotions that come up as we engage in the ordinary activities of daily life. We could continue multiplying these various definitions, yet, following Mace, what becomes clear when we analyse these contemporary understandings of mindfulness is that there seem to be two directions in current usage. First, the desire, as Mace puts it, to concentrate on the bare attention, to observe Buddha-like the passing show of sensations, thoughts and emotions with no sticky entanglement in them. As neurobiologists and scientists have become interested in the subject, this pure bare mindfulness, difficult as it is to isolate, has become the main source of their study. And again, if you look through those of you who are doing PhDs and theses on it, you're going to spend a lot of time looking at all the literature coming out of it, and you'll see that one of the problems they have is isolating this bare attention, this bare, and with all these things, actually defining what the hell mindfulness is. So we have that on the other hand. On the other hand, writers such as Chosen Bays, already mentioned, or Shapiro, link the practice with wider connotations of heartfulness. So a bit more like what I was talking about in its original Buddhist home. Compassion and the general sort of teleological development of character. So we've got two, if you like, schools of interpretation. One that's housing it in a sort of warm, fuzzy, Buddhist-like home, a bit Star Trek-y sort of place. And then you've got this sort of more, if you like, scientific, analytical approach, which is trying to strip it of all those metaphysical or emotional connotations. Now these debates and definitions may sound rather esoteric, but I think actually on the other hand they go right to the heart of the subject that I'm looking at this afternoon. How far, if at all, can mindfulness be accommodated into an established religious practice such as Christianity? And I think the answer to that question, in typical Peter Tyler fashion, is depends what sort of mindfulness you're talking about. Let me explain. Mace makes the point that Kabat-Zinn's original 1990s formulation of the basic notion of mindfulness, as commonly used today, has, quote, something of the spirit of the US founding fathers, in that, quote, he wanted to make mindfulness available without any requirement to accept or reject particular religious beliefs. So it's very democratic, very open to all. And there can be no doubt that this agnostic method, assuming no adherence to any particular religious belief system, as expounded by Kabat-Zinn and his followers, has clearly filled a hole in the collective psyche that was left when the box "no religion" was ticked in numerous surveys, censuses and questionnaires. Now, as to the mechanisms of that, I'm not qualified to talk about that, and that's for other people, might be people in this room, to look at why that is. The skeptical outlook of the Buddha himself, he always advised his followers not to trust his teaching. You know, the famous saying, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. You know, he said, don't trust my teaching. Don't trust anything I've said. He keeps saying this time and time again. He says, test my teachings. Scrape them like a goldsmith testing gold to see if they're counterfeit or real. And this, a Buddhist approach, I think, adds to the ability of the teachings to fit into this prevailing zeitgeist of skeptical humanism within which we find ourselves. As Mace puts it, quote, part of the genius of Buddhism has been to link aspects of spiritual attainment with psychological changes that can be expressed in cognitive terms. This has made it appealing to people in the West who are respectful of reason and believe in human potential but distrust religion. So faced with this question, how far, if at all, can mindfulness be accommodated into an established religious practice such as Christianity? As well as asking ourselves what concept of mindfulness we are applying, as I said before, we also need to ask ourselves a more fundamental question: what concept of religion are we applying to ourselves? And likewise, a mindfulness practitioner will have to ask a similar question, whether they be a Muslim, a Jew, or a Sikh, looking at the implications of the practice of mindfulness for their own religion. Now, as a Christian, taking all this into account, when I reflect on it within my own context, what I've found very helpful is a notion I've come across in the Indian concept of religion. And this I'm taking from the Bhagavad Gita, the great Sanskrit classic. And what we find in the Sanskrit text of the Bhagavad Gita are three paths offered to those who seek the divine. The first path is the path of knowledge, jnana. The second path is the path of karma, action. And the third is the one of devotion, bhakti. So knowledge, action, and devotion. In this latter, the bhakti, God, quote, actively helps the soul to liberation by the exercise of his grace. This is the quote from, I put it up on the board there, from the Bhagavad Gita. The Blessed Lord said, not by the Vedas or grim ascetic practice, not by the giving of alms or sacrifice, can I be seen in such a form as you saw me, but by the worship of love, addressed to me alone, can I be known and seen in such a form and as I really am. So can my lovers enter into me. Do works for me, make me their highest goal. Be loyal in love to me. Cast off all other attachments. Have no hatred for any being at all, for all who do this shall come to me. On me alone let thy mind dwell. Stir up thy soul to enter me. Thenceforth in very truth, in me you shall find your home. A lot of what I'm giving you here has come from a wonderful gentleman. He's quite old now, and I spent a couple of weeks with him in January this year. His name is Francis Vineeth. He's a Christian priest and a monk. He's got a doctorate from Oxford University, studied with R.C. Zaina, and he's got a doctorate from the Benares Hindu University. So he's fluent in Sanskrit and Latin. It's just amazing sitting with him because he just flips from Sanskrit to Latin as I was in his ashram. And he writes, the Bhakta, the person who follows Bhakti, this is a Christian, by the way, we've gone back to Christianity now. The Bhakta lives in the Lord, having surrendered his mind or her mind and thought, having strengthened themselves by the light of faith, which is beyond all passing waves of human knowledge. The Bhakta rests in that profound peace which the Lord gives them as their special gift. That's one of my... This is the preparation of the food in the ashram in the morning. So you see they're all very happy there. The term bhakti comes from the Sanskrit root bhaj, which has connotations of sharing, participating, loving, serving and uniting, just as one does in the ashram. Therefore, continues the Indian commentator Thotakara, bhakti contains a collective sense of loving devotion, selfless service and intimate union. As Ramanuja puts it, it is the uninterrupted remembrance of the Lord like the continuous flow of oil. By fixing attention on the transcendent lover, we are transformed into that lover. And here, whenever I read that, I think of John of the Cross. When John of the Cross says in the spiritual canticle, by contemplating the lover, I become the lover. In enamado, enamada. As Martin puts it, this love is mediated through the body, experienced through the senses, with devotees employing metaphors of sight, sound, taste, smell and touch. They even speak sometimes as if they were God, losing all awareness of themselves as separate. Accordingly, as we move into this final discussion of mindfulness within the Christian context, I'd like to make this observation, which is that for Christianity, meditation and insight are insufficient. As well as acknowledging the transcendent or transpersonal element of human life, Christianity supposes this bhakti-like devotion or union between the individual seeker and the divine. The divine master, as portrayed in the scriptures and practices of Christianity, who's one who comes, whoever comes. So you have in the book of Revelation, I stand at the door knocking. Will you let me in? Ritual worship and loving kindness are as important in the Christian tradition as mindful attention, if not more so. And it's almost impossible to conceive of a Christianity that does not have such loving devotion at its heart. To conclude the paper then, I'd like to explore how this bhakti-like devotion is realised in Christian mindfulness. And I'm going to take, hopefully, I think we've got time, take two examples. The first is from the early church writing of John Cassian and Evagrius of Ponticus. And the second, I'm afraid somewhat inevitably, is from the late medieval writings of Teresa of Avila. In describing these two models, I want to propose, as I suggested earlier, that mindfulness as such is not a problem within the structures of Christian prayer, and in fact has been part of that structure of said prayer since its inception. However, as I stated above, I think the Christian prayer tradition is best understood as a dialogue of head and heart. It is not simply cognitive, some of the contemporary strands of mindfulness suggest, although not all mindfulness. In that I'm not making a case for bare attention, as Mace propounds it. The Christian way of mindfulness is, then I would suggest, a prayer of the heart. Secondly, in contrast to some of the Buddhist and psychological models we explored earlier, the Christian path is one that clearly acknowledges the transcendental, transpersonal within the human personality. And that, I'm sure, is something that we can discuss afterwards. I'm sure not everyone agrees with that statement anyway. Christian prayer mindfulness can be distinguished, I would argue, from Buddhist prayer, in that for the Christian there is always a transcendental perspective on the soul. This may be the case in some of the types of Buddhist prayer we looked at before, but it is not necessarily so. And in fact, whole swathes of Buddhist tradition are very opposed to that notion. There's a very nice writer called Stephen Batchelor. I don't agree with what he writes, but he's a very good writer. And he's written a bestseller called The Buddhist Atheist. You know, that's perfectly legitimate within the Buddhist tradition, you know, to expound an atheist perspective. That's absolutely grand. So with those caveats in mind, I shall look at these two examples from the Christian tradition. The first, as I said, is from John Cassian and Evagrius Ponticus. One of the classic, one of the oldest formulations of prayer in the Christian tradition comes from Evagrius Ponticus, his book on prayer, where he writes, "Prayer is a conversation of the Spirit with God. Seek, therefore, the disposition that the Spirit needs in order to be able to reach out towards its Lord and to hold converse with him without any intermediary." What is immediately striking in this quote is that the 2 points I want to draw out that distinguish Christian prayer are evident in this famous definition. That prayer, meditation, is a relationship with the transcendent one, and secondly, that it is a bhakti relationship based on devotion and adoration. Further, Evagrius outlines the third key element of the Christian notion of meditation, that it is a conversation without intermediary. Such a conversation takes place in the intimacy of our hearts with Christ. Where and when is a question for the individual seeker. These things are not prescribed. Francisco de Osuna, writing around 1500, begins his treatise, Third Spiritual Alphabet, by saying there are 10,000 types of people and 10,000 types of prayer. You know, as we say nowadays, pray as you can, not as you can't. You know, the worst thing is someone comes to you for spiritual direction and they say, "Oh, I can't pray," and when you start unpacking it, what they mean is, "I can't pray according to the way I've been told to pray." You know, according to a particular prayer manual or something they were told 40 years ago when they were a kid. You know, and then you actually say, "Well, actually, there are other ways of praying. You know, you don't have to do it that way." So really, you know, there's a great liberation for many people. Clements, in his wonderful book, The Roots of Christian Mysticism, gives this lovely example from Origen. Origen writes, "Certainly there are countless attitudes of the body, but that in which we stretch out our hands and lift our eyes to heaven is to be preferred for expressing with the body the disposition of the soul during prayer. But circumstances may lead us to pray sitting down, for example, when we have a pain in the legs, or even in bed because of fever. For the same reason, if, for example, we are on board ship," I happen to be stuck on the train this afternoon, "or if our business does not allow us to withdraw to perform our duty in regard to prayer, it is possible to pray without taking up any particular outward attitude." You see the resemblance here with the Buddhist stuff I gave you earlier. "As for the place, you should realize that every place is suitable for prayer. However, in order to pray undisturbed, it is possible to choose a particular place in one's own house. if practicable. It's a kind of hallowed spot, and to pray there. As to establishing what happens in this Christian mindfulness, as promoted by these early fathers, I'd like to concentrate on the passages in Cassian's conferences, those in conferences 9 and 10, specifically on prayer. Key to Cassian's notion of prayer is the establishment of what he calls purity of heart. It's that term again. Or at other times, tranquility, tranquilitas. He writes, and when again, listen to this. I mean, it doesn't take much of a stretch of imagination to go into that Buddhist mindset we began with. When the mind has been established in tranquility, has been freed from the bonds of every fleshly passion, and the heart's attention is unwaveringly fastened upon the one and the highest good, it will fulfill the apostolic words, pray without ceasing. For when the thoughts of the mind have been seized by this purity and have been refashioned from earthly dullness to the likeness of the spiritual and the angelic, whatever they take in, whatever they reflect upon, whatever they do, will be most pure and sincere prayer. Here we see Cassian adopting a familiar trope of the early desert fathers and mothers, and one familiar to our Buddhist friends too, that the self is at war with itself. We have anxieties, disturbance, sufferings, which we need to resolve through the practice of prayer as we try to develop what he calls tranquility of mind. He writes, when our mind finds further occasions for spiritual thoughts, others creep in, and those of you who do any meditation will be familiar with this, depressingly familiar with this. Others creep in, and those that have been laid hold of slip away rapidly. Thus our soul, animus, has no constancy of its own, nor does it possess of its own power any immutability with regard to holy thoughts, even when it seems somehow or other to hold on to them. Like Evagrius, there is no constancy to the mind for Cassian. Again, this is close to the Buddhist psychology we looked at earlier. For Cassian then, the purpose of prayer meditation is to produce that stability of heart, that purity of mind, where the wandering mind will be held in stability. Quote, according to the degree of purity to which each mind has attained, and according to the nature of the condition either to which it has declined because of what happened to it, or to which it has renewed itself by its own efforts, these change at every moment. So far then, so very Buddhist, and indeed mindful. However, as stated earlier, what is striking in the Christian tradition of mindfulness is that the notion of bare attention needs to be linked with the bhakti-like devotion to the Saviour. In this respect, Cassian follows the example of the other early fathers in adding to this, frankly, to be honest, Neoplatonic conception of the soul, the bhakti-like sense of devotion that we find in all the Christian scriptures. In this case, by quoting St. Paul's first letter to Timothy, quote, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions and thanksgiving be made for everyone. And from this, for the rest of his chapter, paragraph 9 onwards, Cassian creates his notion of 4 types of prayer available to the Christian seeker. And again, this is a very famous classification that will have a big impact on the future understanding of prayer in the Western tradition. So he takes the 4 as described by Cassian, described by Timothy. Supplication, obsecratio, is an imploring or a petition concerning sins, by which a person who has been struck by compunction begs for pardon for their present or past misdeeds. Secondly, oratio, prayer, are those acts by which we offer or vow something to God. This, according to Cassian, is a transcendental posture, whereby we place ourselves in right relationship with the transcendent. It's often helpful to think, I think, of Christian prayer as literally like a cross. You've got a transcendental relationship with the divine, and then you've got a horizontal relationship with your fellow human beings and creation. And this second one, the oratio, is very much on the transcendental line. Third, we had intercessions, postulatio, and those are that which we are accustomed to make for others. So this is the horizontal. When our spirits are fervent, beseeching on behalf of our dear ones and for the peace of the whole world. This is the way we remember those around us. And then we have thanksgiving, gratia, whereby recalling God's past benefits, contemplating his present ones, or foreseeing what great things God has prepared for those who love him, he offers to the Lord in unspeakable ecstasy, per excessus ineffabalis. Mindfulness, then, in this early Christian sense, cannot be divorced from its place in the early Christian schema of bhakti-like devotion to the transcendent. Transcendent devotion to the transcendent other, coupled with the need for dedicated action to our fellow human beings. This is the Gita's path of the karma yoga. Just as the early Buddhist sense of mindfulness, as I expounded it, is concerned with the need for dissolution of the bonds of dukkha by contemplation of non-self. All four stages of prayer for Cassian are preparations or stages for the final ecstatic bliss of wordless union, intimated in the final category of thanksgiving, the exceedingly fervent and fiery prayers. Preces ferventissimas et ignitas. As the lover is united with the divine beloved. Again, it's like the bhakti devotion. Visited in particular by those who attain the purity of mind and stability of heart. Cassian thus finishes his exposition by relating these four types of prayer, first to the example of Christ, and then through the schema of the petitions of the Lord's Prayer, which for Cassian perfectly demonstrates these 5 levels of prayer meditation. In summary then, what we see in Cassian is a view of Christian prayer that follows the Trinitarian model of Christ praying to the Father as the basis or template for all future Christian meditation. Simply put, he describes Christian prayer as having 2 axes, a vertical transcendental immanent axis, whereby the lover seeks the beloved, and a horizontal communal axis, whereby all true Christian prayer will lead to action in the world, especially manifest in alleviating the sufferings of one's fellow human beings. Prayer, mindfulness then, in this early Christian sense, is not a means to an end. It is an end in itself. And one could say it is what makes us human. He says, in it, the concept of prayer, there is contained no request for riches, no illusion to honours, no demand for power, no mention of bodily health or of temporal existence. In this respect, the current fashion of finding mindfulness helpful to alleviate physical symptoms in oneself would not be part of Cassian's understanding. However, as we mentioned earlier regarding the Bhakti tradition, the aim of the encounter is not just a conversation, but for the lover to be transformed into the loved one. This technically is what we'd call deification. Isaac of Nineveh puts it nicely when he says, when the Spirit dwells in a person, from the moment in which that person has become prayer, he never leaves him. He's got this, what he writes this lovely stuff about, if you pray enough, you become prayer. You turn into prayer if you pray. Wonderful stuff. For the Spirit himself never ceases to pray in him, whether the person is asleep or awake. Prayer never from then onwards departs from their soul. What we therefore end up with following the Christian Bhakti, according to Cassian and the Fathers, is a state approaching the mindfulness with which we began. However, in this Christian case, it is a state that embraces mindfulness or awareness of the transcendent in the immanent, a clear distinction with the Buddhist and secular techniques with which we began. I'm afraid poor old Teresa's not going to get a look in, so I'm going to move straight on to the conclusion. We can talk about her in the it's more of the same when I talk about Teresa. It's always good to leave people wanting more anyway. So I'll get straight to the conclusion. Time to draw a few strands of this discussion together. I began with the Mindfulness Revolution and suggested that rather than be afraid of it, Christians should understand that mindfulness is too part of their tradition. Although it is not developed as in the Buddhist schools, and certainly would not have the same teleological aims as I think I've made of the Buddhist prescriptions on sati, it is nonetheless an essential part of what constitutes Christian prayer. And I could give you many examples if you know, had time. On one hand, this should not be surprising. I've been engaged with Buddhist thought and thinking now for over 30 years. And some years ago, having met a Catholic priest with similar interest, I asked if it was possible to reconcile the two. Of course, he replied without hesitation, to be a good human being is to be a good Buddhist. I seem to get a lot of these mystic sayings from people, and then spend another 20 years trying to work out what the hell they meant. Anyway, it is in this spirit that I have since approached the teachings of the Buddha, and indeed the contemporary rediscovery of psychology and mindfulness. For me, true Christian prayer will always contain an element of mindfulness. But Christianity, being a religion based on bhakti and karma yoga, as well as knowledge, must supplement bare awareness with the devotional love of heartfulness. In fact, it could be argued that Christian prayer goes beyond mindfulness to the prayer of the heart, which is why I, for one, will continue to use the term heartfulness as central to the Christian notion of prayer. For Cassian, the litmus test of true Christian mindfulness can only be found in what Teresa of Avila called the good works, which you must practice in pastoral care to others. Time and again, she's managed to get in anyway. Time and again, she always does. Time and again, she urges us to consider the effects of our meditation, not only on ourselves, but on those around us. She gives a very good example. Christian mindfulness, in this sense, must thus remain a contraspiral, a sign of contradiction, what Thomas Merton called the sign of Jonah. And this is what I call the horizontal dimension of the prayer. What begins as self-absorbed meditation must lead us from the busyness of everyday life to the transcendental perspective of Christ in the Beatitudes. Here, in this loving bhakti devotion to the crucified one, amongst the poorest and weaknesses of our society, will true Christian mindfulness be born. This prayer, or rather action of the heart, becomes then the practice of Christian mindfulness, the true and perhaps only source of awareness and liberation. Thank you very much.